Very good.
Hello, Layla. We'll just keep you waiting a minute while we get everybody sat down, but thank you very much for attending.
Thank you. I hope my office has explained we're in the middle of the Environment Bill, and at some point in the next hour, I'm going to get called away to vote 4 times. So I have no control over when that happens. So I'll just do my best until that happens, but it's all for very good reason.
Yeah.
I'll explain a bit later about what we're voting on. I think we find it quite interesting, but yeah, just a health warning.
Okay.
Hello, Layla. Hello. Welcome, everybody. I'm really proud and delighted and pleased to welcome you to this really important event. Great to see so many people. Ollie, I know you're here representing lots and lots of young people with their questions as well, so it's really good to get everybody together to be able to discuss these key issues and, importantly, to have Neil's input and Layla, of course. So nice to see you. Thanks very much, everybody.
Right, we've got a list of questions to ask you. So we've got some carbon cutters questions and we've got some from the youth, from Ollie. So I'm going to start off with the first question. How much interest or concern about climate change do you find from constituents and in Parliament, and how much willingness to accept the lifestyle changes that will be necessary?
Well, first of all, hi everybody, it's lovely to see you, and it's really helpful to have this opportunity to speak to all of you. I've been very supportive, both the school and Carbon Cutters, and indeed anyone who wants to do anything on the environment for a long time. And the health warning that I gave earlier is that we are actually currently in the middle of the Environment Bill. I've already voted 4 times earlier today on various things. We will be voting in probably about 20 minutes, half an hour, something like that. And just to give you a sense of what we're voting on, the first, and this is in answer to the question, there's a huge amount of interest in the constituency on all sorts of things that are environment, climate, biodiversity, the whole lot. And indeed, in my post bag, it very often comes top. And so examples of things that I get lobbied about are the use of pesticides and its effect on honeybees. So we put down in the Lords an amendment that strengthened the legislation. And this amendment was an amendment to fix the gap in pesticide authorization process, which currently omits any assessment of the long-term effects of pesticides on honeybees and omits any assessment of the effects on wild pollinators. So we tried to correct that in the bill, and the government are about to overturn it again. So I'm going to go and try my best with my vote to ensure that the government takes account of the long-term effect of pesticides on honeybees. And sadly, we'll probably lose, but it makes me realise that I am very much, in the right part of the world with the right amazing people behind me, trying to make the case to the government. And why they don't just do this, I still don't fully understand, and we will, I'm sure, come on to discuss that. But it is very often top of the post bag, and especially, I should say, with young people. So some of the most amazing contributions that I get are when groups of young people, either in their classes or as part of our school clubs, will write to me, and it's so wonderful to get those letters because it really helps me campaign. And when I'm able to speak about these things in the House, I try and raise their voices, often using their words, because I think it's really important for the government to realise, we are doing this not just for ourselves, but for safeguarding the planet for future generations. And to the question around how willing are people to make the lifestyle choices necessary, I actually think overwhelmingly they are. I think the argument as to whether or not we need to change what we are doing has been won, and that is in no small part to the decades of campaigning that I know that some of you in this room have undertaken for sure, but also, again, the movement of young people over the last few years really galvanizing governments to act across the world, and I was so proud to be able to support them in doing that, even when the government didn't want them to, and it was the right thing to do. So I do think there is enormous appetite to change how we do things, but I do think there is a place for government to help people to do that. And some of the measures that have been unveiled in the last few days, I don't think go far enough. You know, some people can't afford to make the lifestyle choices that are necessary. It's expensive, a lot of these changes, and I don't think the government goes far enough. But I'll leave it perhaps to other questions to go into a bit more detail about what I do think needs to change.
All right, thank you. And the next question is from Ollie.
Shall I go this one?
Stand up.
I'll stand up. I'll stand up. Shall I start saying my last update? So, all my questions I've collected from young people in the project I work for. We work in little villages in and around Abingdon, and these are all 4 of these questions are from 4 different young people. And the first one is, how is the climate and climate change affecting animals?
Okay, so in terms of how climate change is affecting animals, I'll start with humans are animals. So there is a huge effect on humans, which I think we cannot ignore. In particular, and this I know is linked to a few other questions, in parts of the world where they just don't have the same level of climate resilience that we do, and it's going to cause mass migration, it's going to cause starvation, and it's going to lead to literally devastation in countries that are less temperate than ours. But the effect and the interplay between climate and biodiversity, I think, is one that is often missed and we don't talk about enough. And I, as often as I'm able, when I'm talking about climate, I try and mention biodiversity. I don't know if any of you as youngsters liked dinosaurs. I was a massive fan of anything to do with dinosaurs when I was growing up, and recently listened to a podcast that I can thoroughly recommend on Audible called A Grown-Up's Guide to Dinosaurs, where they talk through some of the latest science. And there was an episode in that that made me reflect and was very clear that we are currently going through a mass extinction event on the same scale as the one that was faced by the dinosaurs. We just take it as read that, you know, these extinction events, you know, somehow we've got this view that it happens all in one go. Well, actually, it's happening every single day. Species are dying, never to be seen again. That has an enormous impact on humans, but also the biodiversity and health of our planet overall. And I think raising the profile of that mass extinction and how important biodiversity is as important as the climate emergency. And of course, the two are linked, because if you've got rapidly changing climate, then that is going to lead to the mass extinctions, which in turn is going to lead to disruptions of the ecosystem, and over again, it continues. So tackling one and the other are 2 sides of the same coin, but one is very often missed. So thank you for the question. I think it's important to talk about it.
Thank you.
Okay. Right, the next question is from Anne.
What input will you and the other MPs have into COP26?
So the short answer is, in reality, not much. A lot of the work of COP26 has been being done by offshoots of both the Cabinet Office and DEFRA. Alok Sharma is the minister. He's got his own department that members of whom were seconded from other departments who've got particular expertise. And they've been working on this all year. At various points, MPs have been asked to kind of feed in. So when there have been debates, when there have been statements, so we take on perhaps a slightly more sort of scrutiny role, a feeding in role. But in terms of directly, what input do we have to the negotiations, which have already happened, because while the conference itself doesn't actually start until the 31st, much of the commitments are made well in advance, and a lot of that is done without the specific input of MPs. That said, that doesn't mean I haven't tried. So just because I haven't been invited to be part of it doesn't mean that I haven't tried. And all the way through the year, we've done letters to Alok Sharma when people have been raising various aspects around COP. We've been lobbying, we've been asking questions. So we've been, you know, not shying away from coming forward with particularly what constituents have been cared about. It's been really, really varied what I've been asked to lobby him on. But actually to the event itself, very little. As it currently stands, I'm not set to go, although I have requested to go. So what the government did, and it was a little bit sneaky, I have to say, is they wrote to us, but I should say they didn't make it very prominent, saying you've got 5 days to apply if you want a ticket, and please give us the reasons why you should go. Most MPs missed that deadline. I wasn't the only one, although I take it on the chin that there was the opportunity. Since then, we have been lobbying quite hard behind the scenes to try and get you to go and be part of it. And when you get there, there are a couple of areas in the conference that you can then interact with other lawmakers. As to, you know, would I be part of the negotiations themselves even if I did go? Well, the answer would be no. It would be, you know, in and around the area and in around the centre itself. So, you know, I should also say though, COP is not the end. COP needs to be seen very much as the beginning. I think we need to expect that we will be disappointed by what comes out of COP. Already, those who are closer in and those who are experts in this field, and I would wager that many of you in this room are far more expert in it than I, and I defer very often to the amazing knowledge that I am able to draw from our constituency, because we've got some real experts and people, including people who sit on the Independent Panel for Climate Change and you know, other bodies that have real influence in this space. I think, you know, this is going to be an endeavour that we're going to have to continue. I think we will be disappointed by COP, I'm sorry to say, but I also, the only chink of hope is that, you know, if they underperform doesn't mean we can't still push and achieve something. We need to continue to hold the government to account if they underdeliver, especially.
Right, thanks very much. And the next question is from Ollie.
So another question from young person is climate change only caused by humans?
Thank you for that question, Ollie. The answer is no. Fluctuations in the climate and fluctuations in the overall climate health have changed over time. We've seen that. The problem is, though, you can't accept that as evidence that therefore man-made climate change in the exponential way that we have seen it grow since the Industrial Revolution has nothing to do with humans. It is patently true, and if you look at any graph, and it's very obvious that humans have caused this. And this is what's different about this particular change in the climate, because when before it was natural disasters, it was natural changes that had caused different degrees of warming and cooling over the cycle of the many millions of years that our planet has existed. It is in fact humans that have caused this one, and that's why we need to take responsibility. I hope that answers your question. I'm just going to switch off this. There you go, it's gone. Thanks.
All right, thank you. The next question is from Richard Riggs.
Richard isn't here, so should I ask it on
Yeah.
behalf? Please can you explain the different powers and responsibilities of the various official bodies, for example, the Committee on Climate Change, Climate Assembly, and others?
So in terms of, you know, a flow chart of how all of these work together, I am no expert. I can tell you what I understand those committees to be. So in terms of the independent panel, that is meant to have been the body that holds the government to account. They are completely independent. As I say, we're very lucky to have members of that panel who live among our community. And what they do is they provide updates and reports that, a bit like how the OBR is going to hold the government to account on its economic forecasts and give a very evidence-led, very scientific lead on where the climate is and what the government needs to do. So that's what that panel does, and it feeds into government and is totally independent. And then you've got the Climate Assembly, which was brought together in order to make sure that there were people of ordinary members of the public who were involved in tackling some of the, well, what do we do now questions. So how, if the government is serious about actually answering what are in IPCC reports and to their own targets, which often I don't feel are quite strong enough, how do we then make sure that what we do is done in a way that ordinary people A, understand, and B, feel is something that they can tackle. So that's those two committees. But in terms of the others, there are very many others. And what in government is happening is they're all feeding into various departments. And I mentioned the Cabinet Office, which has a coordinating role across government, but you also have Alok Sharma, who is sitting directly in Cabinet, specifically looking at COP. He works very closely in a department called phase, which is the energy for business, industry and energy and skills. So there was a lot in that department. And one of the arguments that the Liberal Democrats make is that we need to separate out energy and climate change into its own dedicated department so that it can get the attention that it deserves, so that all those different bodies that then feed in know where they're feeding in. And you, rather than having a group of civil servants who have come together just for a temporary basis, as they have now for COP, that actually this is made a priority by again having its own department. It used to, by the way, be its own department. The Tories collapsed it into another department, and we think that was a mistake.
All right, thank you. And Ollie, another question?
So this question was from a young person who is he's asked loads of good questions all the time, and half the time I'm there like, I don't know the answer to it. This one, where can a young person go to breathe fresh air with little pollution?
That's a lovely question. And you know, so first of all, we need to recognise that air pollution is a massive problem in our country. We have many times now breached the very basic levels as set by the WHO and other health bodies for air particulates, and indeed have been successfully taken to court on a number of occasions as a government for not keeping those levels low enough. In our local area, I work with groups to try and find ways to help manage air quality. So I've worked with groups who are particularly concerned in Abingdon, but also in Botley. The number one step very often is to monitor, and we've got some air management zones that we're working really hard to try and tackle. I think it's a really important step that the county council, now that it's changed political makeup, and so it's got its Rainbow Alliance, has made environment one of the top issues that it cares about, and is looking again at transport strategy to try and get that modal shift of people out of cars and walking and cycling and trying to get around in a way that's much greener. Part of the reason to do that is because air quality in parts of our community are incredibly bad, and in fact across the country, I think it's something like there are more children killed by air particulates than there are by smoking these days. I mean, it really is a crisis, and yet when it came to smoking, it is now completely inconceivable that you would light up in front of a child, but we don't take the same level of seriousness when it comes to pollution. So to the specific question of where should they go, well, I have to say, the further away you are from arteries that get clogged up, the better it is. Is there anywhere that has no pollution whatsoever? I honestly can't answer that question. I will defer to people who do the monitoring for such things. When I want to take a lovely walk around Abingdon, I will go to places like Radley Lakes, which I find are, absolutely beautiful. But I have to say, the number of HGVs that are going up and down there, I rather suspect that it's quite polluted. And behind where I live in Botley, we've got the beautiful open fields and the hearths, and in the fields themselves. I think we are very lucky. There are some stunning places in our very close environment where we can go and what feels like get fresh air, but the real issues lie in our cities and our towns. And the way we're going to tackle that is to achieve that modal shift of getting people out of their cars, stop relying on fumes to get us around places, and find better ways of doing that don't pollute in the same level as they currently do. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Right, the next question has been set by Catherine. Will I read this one out? Yeah. So Catherine wanted to know, what is your view on promoting reduced meat consumption? Is it equally important to enable more farmers to raise animals in a way that promotes animal welfare and the environment, while keeping prices reasonable. Will these issues be raised at COP26?
Thank you. To the specifics of if this is raised at COP26, I'm going to say I don't know, but I can find out. But should people do it? Actually, I think absolutely. And in fact, before I was an MP, I was a teacher. I was a secondary school teacher and ran a number of afternoon clubs. And in one of them, it was a sort of advocacy club. So the idea was a bit like a student council type thing. And the students wanted to make a difference to the carbon footprint of the school. And so together we came up with a proposal. This was now 20 years ago, so I'm sure many more schools do this anyway. But the proposal was to have meat-free Mondays in the school, where we would encourage everyone to, if they brought in a packed lunch, to make it a vegetarian one. If we had, and we had a cafe, so we worked with the catering team to ensure that every Monday to try and reduce the carbon footprint in the school in that way. And it is incredibly effective. But as you rightly point out, in order to do that, we also have to accept that some people will want to eat meat. And while that happens, there are ways that you can farm, and changes to the agricultural sector are in many ways the most difficult bit of decarbonisation that we have yet to tackle. I don't know how many of you have visited the farm up in Whiteham, FAI farm, that is linked to the university. If you haven't, they had an open day during the summer. I'm hoping they'll do it again. And it was a privilege to go around, because what they're doing is they're researching in how to decarbonise meat production in a number of different ways. And you know, there is a certain amount that's going to come from the cows themselves. They fart, not good, bad for the climate. But in terms of, you know, for example, a way of farming that improves biodiversity rather than the current intensive agricultural model that very often leads to a death of biodiversity and indeed leaches carbon from the soil, etc., etc. They are proving that you can be both profitable, to the point about money, you can be both profitable, arguably even more profitable, because you don't have to spend so much money on antibiotics and pesticides, by changing the way that you farm. And this is a bit of a movement that is going across the farming community at the moment. I am evangelizing about it as much as I can. I was talking to a colleague in Scotland who apparently was saying his own farmers are doing similar things. And what we need now is government support in the initial phases to allow farms to do that. And with, you know, as many of you know, I fought against Brexit, but if there were opportunities in Brexit, it is that the subsidies that you can start giving to farms now is set to be set by government. And one of the things that they should be doing is carbon betterment and biodiversity betterment in the support for farmers, in not just how they farm, but also how they're custodians of the countryside and custodians of the landscape. And there is a big gap right now because the government has not announced how they're going to do that. I see that as an opportunity to encourage the government to look at places like that farm in Whiteham who are doing it better for actually less money than if they had done a more traditional pesticide intensive, less biodiverse, helpful way of farming.
Okay, great. Ollie, another question?
Yeah. So the next question is, what is the most effective way to cut down your carbon footprint?
I don't think there is one silver bullet. And I think that's the thing that we need to remember. I think different families and different people are going to be at different points in their lives. And I think actually, rather than suggest to people, just do this one thing, it's not going to be just one thing. It's not just about giving up meat, although I personally am trying to, and I'm definitely eating more vegetables and less meat these days, but I'm also being really careful about where my vegetables come from. So the other thing you can do is eat local. You know, to what extent are you buying vegetables out of season, or do they have to be getting on the plane all the way from Peru or Ecuador or wherever they're coming from, actually eating a bit more seasonally? If you are going to eat meat, having higher welfare meat, perhaps less often, and trying to buy it from farms locally. So I tend to buy my meat from Hedges butchers, because they tell me that they are very careful about who they buy from, and it's all within a sort of 10-mile radius, more or less, of where they sell it, and I think that's important to me. But some people struggle to do that for whatever reason. It might be that the way you decide to improve your carbon footprint is to stop driving, or if you can afford it, and a lot of people can't, but get an electric car, although I should say that's a little bit controversial because the cost to make the batteries and the car itself is itself under a lot of scrutiny, quite rightly. So I think there's a lot of different things we should be doing, and I think the government can support us much more in what we do. I'll tell you one thing that I think the government should do better, and that is to insulate people's homes. I think that is the obvious thing for them to do. And the reason why that is important is because, and I've kind of spoken about it a little bit, but I think I need to say it really obviously, we have to make sure that the people who wouldn't ordinarily be able to afford to decarbonise as quickly as others are supported the most. And it tends to be poorer families who are going to feel rising fuel bills more. If we've got higher prices for food, it's poorer families who are going to struggle the most to make those choices. And the reason why insulating homes is such an important thing to do is because disproportionately it will be poorer families who are helped by that policy change. And so there was a lot that was already put in place years ago. The Tories stopped it, they're now starting it again, but nowhere near to the ambition I think that we need. And frankly, whilst I was slightly critical at points of the Insulate Britain group in how they did it, because I think actually let's mix it up. If you're going to protest, do it in lots of different ways rather than just have one way of doing it. But that said, what they were trying to achieve, I was totally on board with and supported them and anyone else who was making the case for why insulating Britain should be a top priority for this government that I think they are failing in.
And thank you. The next question is from James.
What sort of help or support would you like from carbon cutters and others?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to say a thank you, because carbon cutters have been, and at various points, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person, I hope you understand why. The magic of Zoom, much as we're annoyed by all of it, makes this possible. But I genuinely find it really helpful when you write in. So when I've been, and I don't know how many of you have signed, the CEE bill stuff that I've been getting through the inbox recently, or were involved in various, events, or even were involved in conversations around Abingdon becoming a transition town, and whatever it is, the conversation that's happening with carbon cutters. I should say I am still on your mailing list, and I really enjoy being on your mailing list, so please don't remove me. Because what it means is that when I am standing up on the floor of the House, I can speak with real authenticity and passion about how much my community cares. And you keeping in touch in all the different ways that you do helps me do that. The other thing I would say, though, is the other thing that Carbon Cutters often does, which helps me, is it makes me aware through the different initiatives of what's happening locally at a level that perhaps I haven't always appreciated. And we've got lots of fantastic groups like Carbon Cutters and others across the county who are in touch with me and feed in. And that understanding of how, for example, the Green Homes grant, which the government has mismanaged and now has taken away, they were coming up with great ideas for how we could do that better, how we could repurpose it, how we should be doing it differently. And I was then feeding that back into the government. So honestly, thank you. I don't think there is necessarily more off the top of my head, but I'm always happy to work with you on whatever initiative you come up with, because it's always been really fruitful. So thank you for everything you guys do as well.
Okay. Ollie?
So the next question is, why is having a high carbon footprint a bad thing?
Because we only have one planet, but at the moment, if we continue as we are going to end up using all of its resources. And we treated the planet as if it was an infinite resource for far too long. What a carbon footprint is essentially a proxy. Now, it's a way of measuring how much of the planet's resources we are using in various ways. And then we are then pumping those resources very often in a toxic way into the atmosphere, which in turn is killing off the same resource that we're using. What I'm seeking and what I think we need to move to, and this is where the words, you'll hear the word sustainable a lot when it comes to the environment. And for me, what sustainability means is that you are using what is available, but no more, you know. And if you want to use more, you have to find a way of striking a balance where you end up putting it back at another time. So if we are going to use fossil fuels in order to heat our homes, there is a consequence to taking that carbon out of the ground, and it's going to end up killing the planet. So we need to reduce our carbon footprint. And I don't want to get too fatalistic about it, but if we don't, as collectively reduce our carbon footprint, then we may well find ourselves with no planet to live on. And that is not the legacy that I want to leave my children and future generations. That is not what I want. And this is our moment where we might be able to mitigate that disaster. There's been some talk in the news recently about, you know, do we use these words too much? Are they too strong? Is it a disaster? Is it the catastrophe? And my answer to that is absolutely yes, it is a catastrophe. And frankly, we haven't done enough. It's made me really angry. It's made me really anxious. I'm really pleased that I'm in a position to be able to shout at the government. And I thank you all for allowing me to do that. Because if I wasn't an MP, I think I would be an absolute nervous wreck at home because of the inaction that this government and other governments are taking at the moment. But it is a catastrophe. It's staring us in the face. But the positive is that we can still do something about it.
Okay, thank you. The next question is set by Judith.
Hi, Layla. You
Hiya.
touched a little bit on this in your answer to the first question, but this is my question. The countries most at risk from climate chaos did not and do not emit many greenhouse gases. This country has contributed hugely toward emissions. Do you think we have an obligation to compensate poorer countries for the loss and damage they suffer due to climate change?
I mean, thank you for your question. And the short answer to your question is yes, we do. I think we owe a historic debt. Actually, I was talking to the Commonwealth envoy from the FCDO about this yesterday, because the Commonwealth is made up of 50% smaller states, many of whom are directly impacted by the effects of climate change in a way that we can't possibly understand. She was talking about, for example, countries in the Caribbean, small islands, which are battered by hurricanes, and it is getting worse and worse and worse as the climate starts to deteriorate. And it is those catastrophic events that will happen more frequently with a greater intensity. And we see it with flooding here, for example, is the one that is probably closest to home. But those enormous events, when they meet an economy that is less resilient than ours, with health systems that are less resilient than ours, in countries that aren't as big and don't have the same market access as us, it can be absolutely devastating on their economies and indeed the people in those countries. It can, you know, in fact, when it disrupts their food supplies, lead to famines and death. And so it really is critical that we don't just compensate them. It's not just a case of, oh, we're sorry, we belched out all the carbon, here's some money. I think one of the things that money helps, and the reason why money helps is because it's going to help countries all over the world implement whatever the climate goals are set at places like COP. So I think the first failure of COP so far has been that, you know, the big carbon belchers, as I like to call them, people like China are not there, but also Saudi Arabia have missed the deadline. I think that's a diplomatic failure. But the other bit of failure is that I think what they're going to end up with is a bunch of climate pledges where they might attribute some money towards the implementation, but not enough to create the societal shift that's going to be needed in all countries in the world to make sure that we actually do this. Because it's all very well writing it down on paper. If it's not then done, you might as well have not bothered. So that's one of the things I'm looking for very critically over the next few weeks as the various commitments come out. But I will just end by saying, I think I don't have much hope, because as we've seen in the last year, the Conservatives have broken their manifesto promise of keeping to 0.7% of aid to the world's poorest countries. And the reason why that's important, they've reduced it to 0.5%. And the reason why that's important is because that has made it harder for those countries to fight and mitigate the effects of climate change. And it's so short-sighted in this year when we needed their cooperation and we needed to bring them on board and do this all together, that it leaves me rather disheartened, I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Have you got time for another 2 questions?
Certainly, yeah.
Okay, so we've got the from Victoria Shepherd. Ollie, do you want to ask that one?
Yeah. So the question is, why is the UK government progressing with so much carbon intensive development at a time that they, at least OCC, have declared a climate emergency?
Would you mind repeating that again? It got a bit muffled for me. If you could repeat it a bit louder, thank you.
Why is the government progressing so much carbon intensive development at a time that they, at least OCC, have declared a climate emergency?
Thank you. So, in terms of the developments being climate intensive, one of the things that I think is really a shame is when we had Ed Davey, who's the leader of my party, was the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, there was a rule that said that any new builds that had to be built needed to be zero carbon. And that was an incredibly important piece of legislation, which was then rolled back in 2016. And the reason why they did it was because it was a bit more expensive and the developers didn't like it. Because in order to make a development zero carbon, then you find yourself having to spend a bit of extra money on things like air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps, and thinking about how you're going to, make sure that community has a high quality of life, and it cost them money and they didn't like it, so they stopped it. I think that was an enormous mistake. Why have they done it? Well, because I'm sorry, I'm going to just say it how I see it. I think the government has cared more about developers than the climate, and the reason why they care more about the developers than the climate is because the developers spend a lot of money giving the Conservative Party a lot of money in various forms, in various ways. And I think that is why that happened. It's deeply regrettable that we're in that position. Now, the reason, and in terms of how the local councils fit in, government sets the legislation by which our local plans need to be made. And we are now in a position where the local plans that we are adhering to were set by previous Conservative administrations on those councils. Once they're set in stone, there is a limited amount you can do to stop the number, but I know that, all of the councils, having declared climate emergencies, are now looking to see what powers they have to ensure that whatever development does happen is as green as possible. There is a limit to what developers will accept, and there's a limit to what can now be enforced, because once those permissions go through, it's quite difficult. And actually, I would leave perhaps the detail of that to Neil, who'll be able to talk a bit more about what the plans are at County and at Vale for this. But there was another way this all could have gone. And I don't think the answer is necessarily don't build houses. We do need houses. We need houses that are green. We need communities that have infrastructure. We need to respect our green belt and respect the biodiversity of our wonderful landscape. And I think there is a balance to be struck between all of these things. So I'm not saying don't do those things, but I do think the way it was done was very much putting growth and economic growth at the top of the agenda, when actually there were other things that were more important that should have also been considered at the same time.
All right, lovely, thank you. And the last question is from Sally.
Yeah. This was supposed to be a cheering up question.
Oh, good, I'm glad. Nice to see you, Sally.
What gives you, if anything does, hope for the climate?
Our young people, the next generation, elder school children who went out and campaigned and defied the government very often with their parents, so I'd like to say defying their parents, but actually most of the parents were there with them and happily so. But some of them were defying their schools by deciding to go and protest and tell the government that they needed to do more. And I personally think Greta Thunberg is a hero. I think that she is leading a movement of young people, but we've got our own Greta Thunbergs in all of our communities. And I've loved, for example, at the last election, you know, the Extinction Rebellion hustings that we did, that was chaired by young people in Abingdon, holding politicians to account, making us feel the heat, quite literally, of what the government is doing on climate change. And if COP doesn't deliver this time, the thing that gives me hope is that we have an enormous resource, a campaigning resource in our young people. And all those people are coming through politics right now. I think there was a moment where people looked at young people and said, when are they going to get interested in politics? Why aren't young people interested in politics? Well, I have to say, I don't think we can say that anymore about young people. I think young people are desperately interested in politics because they desperately care for the fate of the planet. And that's what gives me hope. Because if these adults can't sort it out, the young people who are going to come through the system will. And I've got real faith that that will happen.
Wonderful. We've got Neil Fawcett here, our Oxfordshire County Councillor. Would you like to say anything, Neil?
You obviously don't. I work for Layla in my day job as well.
Oh, do you?
So we get to talk about this stuff a lot.
Oh, I didn't realise.
Yeah, no, that's all right. No, that's why I'm. Why it's helpful. Why I can pick up some of the points on the local council stuff that fit in with Layla. But I will say while Layla's here, and I'm going to say. I'll probably say a bit more as we move on. But for me, it is fantastic to be able to work for an MP who is genuinely committed to tackling climate change. The majority of our current MPs in the House of Commons do not necessarily fit that description. There are lots that do, but you know, my take on the Conservatives, Layla just mentioned it really in terms, is that their perception is that there is a conflict between tackling climate change and the nature emergency against economic growth, and that you have to make a choice. You either save the planet or you carry on with economic growth. And to me, that mindset is completely wrong, because actually, if we don't work faster and harder to save the planet, what's the point of economic growth? It's futile. And for me, it's the other way around. What we need to do is work out what do we need to do to tackle the climate emergency and to tackle the nature emergency. That can actually also give us a very successful economy, can create jobs. They'll just be a different type of job. So for me, I'll say this while Layla's still with us, I'm very proud to work for Layla, to support the work that she does, as well as being very proud of what we're now in a position to do on local councils, which we'll go on and we'll probably say a bit more about as we go into the discussion. But so apologies you didn't know that, but me and Layla, we talk a lot about this stuff and about how she can be as effective as possible in Parliament, and the team of staff that support her that I work with on a day-to-day basis are all very dedicated to doing that job. The people who actually actually get the emails and draft the responses that Layla then sends on and so on.
Okay, lovely. Have you got any more time, or when have you got to get off?
You will know when the bell goes. It starts going haywire, at which point I'll go off. We are expecting a vote in, any minute now. So I'm happy to continue, so long as, if I stop midway through, that's why. I literally need to get up and run. So okay. I'm very happy to sort of sit in the background and listen to the discussion, if you like. It's up to you.
Okay, well, should we see if anybody else wants to ask Layla anything or make a comment? Michael?
Yes, hello, Layla. Would you agree that ultimately the problem that is behind all this is population size and population growth, and that ultimately something will have to be done to limit population growth, and if it's not done by proper policies, we will have more wars, more pandemics, and so on, and nature will somehow come in and correct the problem itself?
Gosh, what a question! I mean, I have to say, as a political as a political offer to the electorate, I can pretty much guarantee that no government will ever win with that in their manifesto. So actually, whilst it may be true, and there are many people who know it to be true, and there are younger people choosing to have smaller families or indeed no children at all, because they recognise that, and actually in answer to the question earlier, what's the best thing that you can do for the planet? Well, it's not have kids. And unfortunately, but we need to accept that for a lot of people, and I dare say myself included, that's not a sacrifice I'm willing to make. So what can we do to, if we aren't going to do that, mitigate the effects of it, and meanwhile try and through other perhaps ways of encouraging people to have fewer children. And the best way to encourage people to have fewer children is to educate women and girls, especially in countries with high birth rates, which is why I actually see education, which is my first love and will always be my greatest love. I actually see education as being the way to achieve that, rather than perhaps slightly more draconian one-child policies or whatever that the likes of China may want to institute. I think the way to do it is through education rather than mandation. Is that a word? Mandation.
Thank you.
Okay, James?
Yeah, I just want to say, before the bell goes, can we show our appreciation for her time?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you, and thank you all for being so accommodating, and well done on having a hybrid meeting like this. This is the future, I think. It's not perfect, but you know, better than me not being able to be there for both. So thank you so much for hosting us, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.
You said you were going to tell us something about the bills you were voting for tonight.
Yeah, so if you want, I'll give you the rundown. So it's on the environment bill. Actually, I wonder if some of you have actually written to me about various bits of it. So earlier today we had a number of votes, and the first one that the government stopped us from winning was to introduce stronger air quality targets in line with the WHO. I mean, why the government won't accept amendments like that, I don't know. And I should say at this point, we are, the Lords, so the way legislation works is it has various stages. We're at the stage where the Lords have made a number of amendments, and through cross-party working have made those amendments. It then comes to the Commons, and the government tries to overturn amendments. They either accept amendments or they overturn them. And these are things that, so what I'm telling you as things we're voting on are things that we want to keep and the government want to reject. The other one was amendment to ensure interim targets in the bill are met. I don't know why they don't like targets, but there you go. Amendment to require the Ministry of Defence and Her Majesty's government in transport to have due regard to environmental principles when making policy. Amendment to strengthen the independence of some organisation whose acronym I don't understand, I do apologise. And the ones after this that I'm going to go to now, the first one is about honeybees and pesticides. The second one is on sewage and undertakes that they make all reasonable steps to ensure untreated sewage is not discharged into the storm overflow. I should say at this point, we're starting a really interesting campaign in trying to clean up Oxfordshire's rivers, and to try and even get some of them bathing water status. So I'm really interested in that one. And again, I don't understand why the government wouldn't want to do this. The next is an amendment to limit the Secretary of State's powers under the bill to amend the habitat regulations by only allowing changes to the regulations for the purposes of environmental improvement. And the last one is that a review of the effectiveness of the legislation be carried out in the first and second anniversary of it coming to force. So that's all the amendments that I'm going to be trying to keep, because I think all of those things are good things. Sadly, the government will be voting against us, and the parliamentary arithmetic says that they're going to win, which is quite depressing, and unfortunately is the nature of the parliamentary maths at the moment. But I don't want to end on a glum note, but that is what I'm going to go and do next, is at least you know that I'm there trying to oppose them in doing it.
Anybody have any comments on that?
Can I just ask, what's the argument for not saving honeybees? What's the argument for not saving honeybees?
I actually don't know. I think we've written to them asking for the longer argument. I wasn't in the chamber when all of this has been going on today, so I will find out and get back to you. But I honestly don't know why they wouldn't do this. And actually, it was legislation that it was British legislators that were bringing it into the European Union when this first came, and then it became something that we were taking on here. I don't understand why they wouldn't do this. Sometimes they employ arguments like, oh, we're planning to do it anyway, we just don't want it written in law. Well, if you're going to do it anyway, why not have it in law? So I don't know the specific argument, I'm afraid. I'll go and find out and report back.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you think a lot more legislation is required to legislate against banning of all sorts of different things?
I think there's a huge amount we can still do. I think one of the things that I want is, rather than see climate change as something that's tackled in one bill, or the nature emergency as something that's tackled with one single bit of legislation by one single department in one moment in time, is instead to have targets set for each and every department of government, including the Treasury, for how we are going to achieve this. Because unless you use the full might of the whole of government, in the way that incidentally some other countries already do, then we aren't actually going to get to a situation where it's a mindset, there's a mindset shift that needs to happen across government. And somehow I think their mindset right now is, well, we need to do a few things now to mitigate this for the future. But, once we've got this package now, then, it'll just sort of roll along. And we'll just do everything else as normal and not have due regard for climate change in our spending, and not ensure that every single little thing we do contributes to this aim. When actually you could achieve a lot by having each individual department responsible for its own decarbonisation targets, and then getting all departments, especially through spending in the Treasury, to consider the effect of climate change when they're spending money. Now, the Treasury say they do this, but I sat on the Public Accounts Committee for a long time, and the fact is they don't. They've changed what it's called, the Green Book, but it's not green because of anything to do with the climate and the nature emergency. It's green because it's not red, and it's to do with how the Treasury historically used to do its ledgers. But I do wish they would introduce a proper Green Book, capital G, which is actually all about decarbonisation in the environment, and that actually there gets to be a cost associated with projects that perhaps deliver growth and perhaps deliver money, but if they also deliver a large carbon footprint with that, they shouldn't be funded. And a really good example, I think, of where we won the argument on that was with the Oxford to Cambridge Expressway. Because one of the reasons why they kept saying that it was something they wanted to do was because it would unlock economic growth, and it's this growth agenda that kept coming back. But actually, we wore them down with our campaign, and actually a credit to everyone who was involved in that, and it was large parts of the community who came in. I brought the minister and we were explaining to him, but when I spoke to the officials behind the scenes afterwards, they were saying, yeah, it's basically, if you have a scheme that delivers, for example, cycling, which take cars off the road completely, you are penalised in the way they calculate the money for that scheme. The spreadsheets they use just can't cope with the concept that actually you achieve full modal shift and you don't have people using cars at all. So there's fundamental issues in how they make their decisions that actually lead to this perverse situation where often we're spending money on the worst thing for the environment because the Treasury hasn't caught up. As you can see, I could actually go on about this at some length with a lot of passion for some time, but I also suspect that I'm speaking to the converted right now.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you. So today, the economical growth is the way to measure and compare countries between each other. When do you think that can change and how? So to use, for example, they use climate change.
I can't hear you very well. Can you speak up? Thank you. Sorry.
Yes. So today, the economical growth is a way to compare countries between each other and to classify countries between each other. How do you think this could change and when? And do you think, because today when we hear about climate change, they use it as a way to have a new economical growth using the green energy, etc. But do you think we could change the classification of the countries according to another parameter than economical growth, and how do you think this could be done?
Yeah, thank you. No, it's a really interesting idea. And I mean, is GDP outdated? Absolutely. Because the assumption behind comparing GDP and rates of growth is that growth can continue forever. And the problem with growth continuing forever is at some point you're going to come against the fact that the world is not an infinite resource, because all of this growth comes from somewhere. We are converting natural resources of the earth into commodities, which we then trade. There is a way that you can do it, which is to focus on skills and knowledge and the parts of the economy that aren't using up those resources, which I think is an important part of it. But actually, I think fundamentally we need to be thinking more along the lines of, Kate Rayworth and others who are talking about that finite resource that the world is using, and to think differently about growth, recognizing that actually in of itself, it is potentially quite dangerous if it isn't mitigated against and understood in the context of what it is taking from the environment, as well as perhaps putting back. And I think it's, and I'm not of the opinion, and I know some people are, and perhaps I'm going to start an argument before I go. I don't think all growth is bad, okay? And I think it's really important that I say that. But I do think that some growth is better than others. And I do think that we should be prioritizing that good growth over the growth that is purely exploitative and is ultimately unrecoverable. And I'm very attracted by the new ways of looking at economies. We talk about donut economics and circular economies. And for a very long time, when I was a teacher, I used to teach this to my students as well. It's something we need to teach young people. It's something we need to have in part of our discussions when we talk about things and we talk about the economy. And I think it's true to say that the current economic system is lagging behind what we need it to be, because it is perversely incentivizing all types of growth equally, when I think there are some types of growth that are much better than others. And perhaps this is a good moment for me to back away slowly, because I know that there are definitely differing opinions about this in most rooms of people who care about the environment. So I wonder if this is a good opportunity for me to say my goodbyes and let you guys have your discussion, because I'm reliably informed that we are about to be called to vote literally any second now. So perhaps I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much for coming. We're very grateful for you sparing your time for us. Give her another pleasure. Okay, wonderful. Right, before we go on, we have recorded this particular meeting. Is anybody here unhappy with us sharing it on our website or on Facebook? Because we won't share it if people are unhappy with that. No, so we've got to go ahead on that. Okay, before I hand over to Neil, I need to tell you about our next event, which is going to be a talk by One Planet Living on the 24th of November. We haven't decided yet whether it's going to be online or in person, so we'll let you know about that. And the latest exciting event from Carbon Cutters is that we have had an interpretation board installed on Box Hill Park. So in collaboration with the Town Council, we've planted some trees, some fruit trees on Box Hill Park, and Lucille has been the major driving force in this, and Lucille and Clive and Keith, you actually installed that interpretation board, was it last week? Yeah. Last week. So if you've not seen it, you should go along and have a look at it, because it's really brilliant, and you helped design it, didn't you, Lucille? Okay. Now, is there any other events I've forgotten to mention? We finished our apple pressing, haven't we, Susan?
Done that, yes. We have. Well, there's a few people still harrying it, but we've finished our article on the site.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Right, well, I'll hand over to Neil then. Are you going to tell us a bit about the County Council?
Well, I've got a few things I think it might be worth talking about. First of all, just to introduce myself, because I wear different hats, as is probably already apparent. Firstly, it's nice to see quite a few familiar faces. I am terrible at always remembering names with faces, so apologies if I don't call you by your name when you are someone that I previously met. So yeah, I'm Neil Fawcett. My day job is I work as Layla's Chief of Staff. That's a supposedly half-time paid role, and most of that is managing her staff in Westminster and in the office here in Abingdon. And the team in Abingdon do the casework, as we call it, so they deal with all your emails when they come in, emails from other constituents, draft answers to those, organised surgeries when Layla does them, which have mainly been by Zoom in the last couple of years for obvious reasons, organise her MP visits around the constituency and that kind of thing. And team at Westminster, one of whom is Megan, whose name you can see up there, because that will be the account that Layla ended up logging in on. We have a member of staff and 2 interns. Megan is one of 2 interns who are politics students doing a year in Westminster, and a guy called Sam, who's head of our Westminster office. So I manage that team, and I suppose I'm sort of Layla's chief political advisor insofar as she needs political advice, because mostly she doesn't. But we talk a lot about the issues that are coming up in the constituency and on local councils, and how that applies to her work in Westminster. And one of the things, I guess, that it is a big part of my role is trying to work out what she can do in Westminster to raise the issues that are of concern to constituents, and that are things that she cares about. And we touched on this a little bit earlier. All the different MPs have their own range of interests. Layla definitely sees climate change and the nature emergency as a big part of her priorities. I think that's probably been obvious to local people, and it's something we talked about a lot in the last 2 general election campaigns when she was getting elected and re-elected. It's a big part of my motivation. I'm also a county councillor. I'm currently on the county council cabinet, which is the main group of people that makes decisions. I'm on the Vale District Council and also on the cabinet there, and I'm also on the town council. So I am quite busy. It's nice to be busy running councils and actually being able to start to put some of our priorities into practice. But as we'll come on to, it also can be incredibly frustrating because we don't have a blank canvas. We can't just do what we want. We operate within a often very restrictive set of rules and national legislation, some of which was touched on in some of the questions around development earlier on. And we're very restricted in terms of the financial resources that we have. And I think the thing we found, particularly since we took control of the county council in May in the elections, is that we're also restricted by decisions that our predecessors have made, and we're not always in a position to overturn them. So as came up in the discussion, when it comes to issues like the amount of development that's going on locally, the rate of housing development in Oxfordshire is about the highest in the country. In this district, the Vale of Whitehorse, and our neighbouring district, South Oxfordshire, they are 2 of the fastest housing growth rates at council level in the country. And any of us who travel around the area through whatever form of transport, you will know you can't go very far without seeing a building site. And in fact, you can't go very far without seeing several building sites. And I think it's important to note that is unusual. We are, in this part of the country, we are seeing a very unusually high level of development, well above the average, well above most local councils. But as Layla said, those local plans are now in place. And it's very difficult for any council anywhere to significantly reduce the rate of growth once it's been set. So we're in a position on both the local councils, the district council and the county council, where the question that's facing us is not can we stop all the development, because frankly we can't, we're not allowed to. It's what can we do to mitigate a lot of those plans, and how far do the rules that councils have to operate within, how far can we go within the rules? And I'll give you one example of that was touched on earlier. We are, as a district council that sets the local plan, we are not allowed to insist that developers build zero carbon housing. There are quite a few things we can do in the policies to encourage less carbon emissions from developments, to encourage developers to look at more energy efficient buildings, for example, to encourage developers to look at putting more emphasis on encouraging active travel in the way that developments are designed, rather than being entirely car reliant. But we're always pushing against the national legislation in every time we try and do that. For me personally, I find that incredibly frustrating. Again, getting back to the questions that were asked earlier about sort of young people and what people can do. The first two political organisations I joined were Amnesty International and Friends of the Earth when I was at school. And my whole political career has been around the environment as much as any other issue. So as I say, it's frustrating to not be able to do everything we would like to do. It was particularly frustrating when the government, after the 2015 election, stopped the legislation progressing that would have brought in the zero carbon homes from that point onwards. Just to give you a couple of questions, and I suppose answering the question, what's our view? And I'm speaking now primarily as a sort of Lib Dem councillor. What's our view of what the government is doing? I would summarise it by saying they are doing some good things, but they're doing far too little and far too late. And every initiative they come out with, when you compare it against the scale of the problem, is just inadequate. And on that question of zero carbon homes, for example, one example, I'm sure many of you will have seen in the news this week, they've launched a scheme to subsidise heat pumps for houses. And the amount of money that's in that fund would provide for a £5,000 grant towards the installation of a heat pump in 90,000 houses. And that's, it's a good policy. 90,000 houses isn't very many. There are 25 million houses in the UK. And in fact, another 90,000 will be built in the next 4 months. And because they stopped that legislation around zero carbon houses, hardly any of those 90,000 houses that are built in the next 4 months will be zero carbon. They will all be adding to our collective carbon footprint as a country. So it's a good initiative, but it's far too little. And it's not even making up for the damage that's being done while it's being implemented. And that's if it is implemented, because the Green Homes Grant that they did 2 years ago ended up hardly being spent. So incredibly frustrating. On transport, again, there's been a series of quite substantial funding pots being made available to support active travel. There's an issue around how they do it, because their way of funding active travel at local level is not to say to councils what would be the sensible thing. We're going to give Oxfordshire County Council, for example, £1 million to spend over three years to do what you think is the priority in Oxfordshire. What they do is they set up a pot of money. They say you've got to get a bid in on active travel into this pot in 2 months, and then you've got to spend it in 10 months. And unsurprisingly, lots of schemes do go in, but a lot of them are very rushed. They're not connected to each other. They might provide quite a nice cycle path down one road somewhere in Oxford, but then at the end of that road, you're back onto a big roundabout, which is dangerous for cyclists, whatever. And in terms of the amount of money, the current tranche of funding, which is the third tranche of active travel funds, is £239 million. That is a lot of money. If Oxfordshire got its average share of that, that would be about £3 million. And that can do a lot of good in Oxfordshire. But within a week of announcing that fund, they announced that they were going to spend another £27 billion on more roads. So again, great to have some money for active travel, but as I'm sure most of you know, if you spend extra money on extra road capacity, it leads to more traffic. Sometimes it might provide a road that means that you can drive quicker to the next bit of congestion, which is now worse because there are more cars on the road, but it doesn't solve the problem. So on every different level, we're up against them not doing nearly enough and not doing it nearly quickly enough. And as I said earlier, I think my sense is that they are still in a mindset that you choose between doing the environmental thing or doing the economic thing, and not understanding that there is a different approach, which actually there are other countries in the world. New Zealand is one good example that are already seeing that those two things are not in conflict. And essentially, I think it's the same mistake they made over the pandemic. That from the start, their view was that you could either keep the economy going, or you could put in place the measures that were necessary to deal with the pandemic. What they've proven, and what they've now proven beyond doubt, because again, I'm sure many of you have seen the comparison figures between the state of the UK now with COVID as against most of our European neighbours, what they've proven is that by not tackling the pandemic properly and quickly and seriously, they've ended up doing far more damage to the UK economy as well as to our health, as would have happened if they'd done it properly. So I'm sorry if I'm coming across as negative or a bit cynical or overly frustrated, but that is what we're up against. So the question is then, what can we do? And I think the really important questions that some of you asked earlier on for me are really around what we can do about it. And as an individual, the view I've always taken is that I probably won't change the world, but I might be able to make a bit of the world a bit better. And I might be able to at least mitigate some of the bad decisions that are being made elsewhere. And at that level, I think if you think about it in terms of what can you do, rather than what are the barriers to doing everything we want to do, there is a lot you can do. And at this point, I'll apologise if I get a bit sentimental. Layla mentioned how inspirational Greta Thunberg has been. One of the people that she inspired was one of my children, EJ, who some of you know. EJ, until very recently, was a student in this school, and in fact, the last time I was in this room, it was when she was collecting some results, which was a very sentimental moment for me. But EJ was inspired very much by Greta Thunberg, and started to help organise the Oxford Youth Strikes for Climate, which I'm sure some of you will have been to. One of my proudest moments as a dad was standing in Broad Street in Oxford in a crowd of thousands and thousands of people, while EJ was standing on a box with a loud hailer, I think ordering people about. I don't know where she gets that from, organising that event, and I was incredibly proud of that. But also, it made me realise how one person can make a big difference. And I know that I'm sitting in a room with quite a number of people who work incredibly hard week in, week out to try and make a difference locally. And getting on to answering the question, what can you do to help? What can Carbon Cutters and others do to help, that was asked earlier? One thing you can all do is back us up when we are starting to try and make some of the decisions locally that will make a difference on this agenda. I'll say quite happily within this audience, when you are a councillor and you try and make decisions that you know are the right thing to do, but which some people are very unhappy with, it is hard work. You're in the firing line, and it very often feels like you're in the firing line. A recent, very local example, which some of you may have different views on, that you'll be aware that the Abingdon Bridge has currently got one lane blocked. That's because it needs some work underneath, and it is a scheduled monument, which means there's a very long process that has to be gone through before work can be carried out. Some local residents, some of whom are probably in this room, came up with the idea that if we were going to have to close a lane on the bridge, wouldn't it be a good idea to try out creating a bit of extra space for cyclists and pedestrians and see how that went down and see what the impact of that was? Now, personally, I don't think we did it particularly well. Initially, it wasn't even obvious to cyclists approaching the bridge that they could use some of the space. That improved as it went on the basis of the feedback that we got. But from the moment that was suggested, there were people shouting very loudly, particularly on social media, as they do, that this was a terrible idea. This was idiot county councillors trying to do some kind of bizarre experiment, and people don't walk across the bridge anyway, and they didn't know there was ever a problem. And it's absolutely daft that we might suggest that more people might be willing to cycle if they were given a bit more space in which to cycle and a safer lane and so on. And when that kind of reaction happens, which it will, and it will happen every time we try and do anything, for example, to create more space for pedestrians and cyclists, or every time we try and put in a bus priority measure, and there are going to be a lot of those coming down the tracks, there will be very loud opposition from what is in reality quite a small minority of people who simply don't accept the premise that we need to change how we do things. Now, at the County Council now, and on the Vale and indeed neighbouring South Oxfordshire, what I can tell you is that we have councillors running those councils who absolutely believe we need to change the way that we do things to tackle the climate emergency. There's a limit to what we can do, but we are determined to do what we can. And in the answer to the question, what can you do to help, is frankly, you can back us up in some of those discussions. If you see somebody coming at us on Facebook or on Twitter or in the Herald Letters column saying, this is just silly, somebody described me as I think it was a nonsensical green social warrior. And I mean, I don't quite know what's wrong with being a green social warrior, because a badge I'm quite happy to wear. But there is a group of people who think this is all nonsense. They believe we can just carry on, and that the answer to the problem of traffic congestion and air quality is to build more roads in more places and put fewer blockages in the way of the traffic, particularly things like those silly pedestrian crossings and things like that, so that they can get from their house to wherever they want to be by car as quickly as possible. And I'm sure they don't think of it this way, but frankly, sod everyone else. Every time that argument happens, people like you can help by being a voice on the other side of the argument and back us. And I don't say that, I don't mean by that, I expect you all to back absolutely every detail of absolutely everything we do, because you won't. You'll have arguments with some of it. But every voice that is raised in support of us taking action genuinely makes a difference. Every consultation response that comes in backing up what we're trying to do makes a difference. And I'll mention it now because we passed it at County Cabinet yesterday. There is about to be a consultation on the county's new transport plan. And there is a very strong shift in the document that we're putting out away from road capacity and in favour of active travel and public transport. I think it doesn't go strongly enough, personally. And I would encourage people to write in and say, we like the direction of travel, but we think you should go further, and put in some specific suggestions. That was one of three things we voted on yesterday relating to greening transport. A second was changing the county's approach to 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. So previously, as some of you will be aware, every obstacle that could possibly be put in the way of having a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit was. We now move to a position where the county's position is that we will support 20-mile-an-hour limits in built-up areas where there is community support for them. That doesn't mean we can do them all overnight, but it's a massive, massive switch in attitude. And I'm sure I don't have to rehearse the arguments here, but all the evidence is that if you can reduce speeds down to nearer to 20 miles an hour from 30 miles an hour in urban areas, It is safer, there are fewer accidents, the accidents that do happen are less damaging, it improves air quality, it actually improves traffic flow, but at a safer, steadier pace. And personally, I would like to see every street in Abingdon 20 miles an hour within the distributor road as soon as possible. There'll be a discussion about that, because the town council, broadly speaking, I think is supportive of that as well. So that's one example. Sorry, I'm banging on.
Just at our AGM last night, this is the Fitzharris Manor estate.
Yeah.
That's just what we want. We want 20 miles an hour there, but lots of children going on there to school. So if it can happen tomorrow.
Yeah, but unfortunately, I can't promise that it'll happen tomorrow, but I think there's going to be a big push. There will be a backlash from some people against that, because there are people who think that being able to get from the top of the Oxford Road to the bottom of Drayton Road in 7 minutes rather than 9 minutes is absolutely vital to their way of life, and that we will be attacking their right to drive at 30 miles an hour through Abingdon town centre. And yes, we are, quite rightly so. Yeah, I was going to say, it has to be a good day, doesn't it? The other side of it is that actually one of the most effective ways to encourage people to switch from cars to more active forms of travel, particularly cycling, is to bring down the average speed to a slightly safer level, because it's particularly cyclists and pedestrians who will feel the benefit from fewer accidents and less harmful accidents when they do happen. So that's the second thing that has the potential to make a massive difference just to the whole atmosphere in Abingdon, particularly in the town centre area. And then the third thing we put through yesterday is some very strong policies to move forward on improving bus services around the county, and that would particularly impact on services between Abingdon and Oxford, by looking at working with the bus companies to identify particular pinch points that slow down the buses, which mean that in effect that the bus companies get far less service out of the buses and the staff that they have. And the biggest issue for the bus companies, who are not always perfect, but generally on the right side, is that congestion makes their services less efficient. As their services become less efficient, fewer people use them. They actually, ironically, then get more likely to get back in the car and be stuck in the congestion, holding up the buses. So we got to try and break that cycle. The one thing that is nearest to here that, again, many of you will have experienced if you've ever tried to get into Oxford on the bus in peak hours, is trying to do something to give bus priority at the Hicksey Hill roundabout, where I don't know how many hours in the last 20 years I've spent sitting on the bus queuing to get off the A34 and into Oxford, but that's a particular pinch point that they want to help with. So we passed some very good policy yesterday that will increase our ability to work with the bus companies to start to identify some of those issues. And again, I'm sure there will be some noisy voices arguing against that. And again, any public support you can give, the better. But the key thing I would say is do look at the consultation on the transport plan when it comes in, because that's something that we do have some choices, and the more public support we can demonstrate for the direction that we're moving in, the easier it is for us to put those kind of policies through and get things to happen more quickly. This is all against the backdrop of not having the funding to do half the things we would like to be able to do, but at least if we've got the public demonstrably on our side, it makes it easier. So you look like you want to.
Are there any discussion about the price of the public transport? Is £5 for a return to Oxford?
It is not good value, is it? What we can't do, and we simply wouldn't have the cash to do, is we don't have a budget where we can say to the bus companies, we're going to subsidise 25% off your prices. What we're trying to do is to make changes that mean that the bus companies can run their services more efficiently. And in the long run, that's the way to get prices down. At the end of the day, they want to be able to offer as competitive a price as possible. The problem they have is that if they buy a bus, which costs a lot of money, I don't know exactly how much, but I know it's a lot. And at the moment, on the journey time between Abingdon and Abingdon Town Centre and Oxford City Centre on a bus service like the X2 or the X3, they might get a journey in each direction once in an hour, because it takes them roughly half an hour. So over a 5-hour period, that gives them 5 return journeys. If we can put measures in place that speed up their journey time, so at the moment they say on average 10 minutes trying to get from the A34 into Oxford because of congestion. If that journey can move from being a 30-minute journey to being a 20-minute journey, then over the course of 5 hours, their potential income from that one bus and that one driver increases by 50%. So what we can do is work with them to improve the efficiency of the service, which is good in all sorts of ways, good from a fuel efficiency point of view as well, so that they can run more services from the same kit and then bring the prices down. Or in the long run, not raise the prices more than they already have. So there isn't a simple answer to that one. The other side of it we're looking at is whether there are particular groups of people, like for example young people, where we might be able to look at some kind of discount arrangement.
The very small compensation for all the new houses that are going up in North Abingdon. Do you think bus services will improve and there will be new services to serve these areas, and in particular the reinstatement of the North Abingdon Town Service, which was added several years ago?
So there definitely will be some contribution from the developments. Again, there's been a long argument about how those developments have been designed. My own view is that they're still far too much designed around car travel, not nearly enough around public transport and active travel. We are getting some funding towards better public transport. I think it will lead to better, the current 4 service, which has been reduced over the years, which is the one that runs Abingdon to Wootton and then into Oxford. I think some of the money will be used to improve some of that service. The town service, the town council has actually put some money in to reinstate it partially. So it does now run between South Abingdon, the Leisure Centre and Tesco, I think. But to give you an idea of how much bus services cost, I think the town is spending 30,000 a year just to fund that level of service. So I would love to get back to when we had the town service doing the regular loops in different parts of the town. But we'll need to find the money to do that, I think, from somewhere. And even though the money from a development like the ones in North Abingdon can sound quite big, when you look at what it actually costs to provide that service, it doesn't stretch very far. So what we need to do is to create a situation where it is commercially viable for the bus companies to provide more services, and that means giving them a competitive edge over people driving, which in turn annoys a few people. But we have to, one way or another, face down those people.
I'm thinking really of services that might go, up Wootton Road and then via Dunmore Road and then into Oxford to take the from the new houses. To work.
I think that will be looked at. I don't know enough about the detail to know exactly what the routes will end up looking like. I would say that it has also brought some resources to improve the cycle infrastructure north of Abingdon. We're not far off a position now where people will have a reasonably good route from Abingdon all the way into Oxford. There's various bits, some of you I'm sure do cycle that route, and you will know that there are some stretches that are quite good, and then there's bits where you have to go on road. The new developments are helping with that, so there's some plans to improve through Radley and the bit between Radley and Kennington, for example, the cycling.
It's nice cycling along there.
Yeah, most of it is, yeah.
I'm particularly interested in encouraging more young people to cycle, given we've got this school and other schools and collaboration at sixth form level, and children or young people moving between sites. And when we looked at the quality of the cycle paths around here and talking to young people, they were completely put off using bikes for that sort of thing. And we worked out there's thousands of children who go to school along this road one way and another. And it just seems an obvious place to start making some cycling.
Yeah, I think
it's not all about travel to work, it is about young people outdoors, exercise, safety.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think if you look at the current provision of cycle routes within Abingdon, there are a lot more examples of inadequate cycle infrastructure than adequate. My daily commute now is mainly on the new cycle path from Abbey Meadow up to the Science Park, because Layla's office in Abingdon is actually in the Science Park, and I live in South Abingdon, so that's quite a good path for most of the journey, except for that town centre bit. But mostly we've still got dashed lines on the side of roads which are completely inadequate and which do not meet the new cycle standards that have come in nationally. And again, credit where it's due, the new cycle design standards that the government just brought in are actually a massive step forward. We are struggling already to get them implemented. Our view as a county administration is that that should be the bottom line now for any new development and for any new infrastructure we put in. But we've still got schemes that are being put in because the contracts were already signed, even as we speak, that are not up to that standard yet. So that's something we are looking at working on. But just for example, one of the things that causes me enormous frustration is there's a dashed painted cycle advisory cycle route along Farringdon Road every Saturday. Part of the reason that's there is for the benefit of people cycling to Abingdon School. Every Saturday, I'm sure some of you live near there, every Saturday, that one side of the road, the cycle lane is covered by cars belonging to parents of children at Abingdon School who are attending activities on a Saturday. And I struggle as a parent to work out the logic of how you would do that, but people do. Apologies to anyone in the room in that category, but not really. And I think we've got a long way to go. I think you're quite right. Given the proximity of the different Abingdon secondary schools and the college, it really should be possible to have decent cycle infrastructure linking them up. And again, I mentioned the EJ, my child, they cycled up to here each day. Spring Road is absolutely horrendous to cycle up and down, I'm sure, for anybody, not just children. But I'm sure we could do a lot better. One of the other initiatives that's coming in at the moment is school streets, which I know some of you are familiar with. There's one in at St Nick's, which you will know if you live in that area. Again, I would like to see that around every primary school.
Sorry. Do you want to do one more question because our official time's up?
It's getting to that point where people are starting to leave.
Yeah. Let me just make one more comment on cycleways, because one problem with inadequate cycleways is that cyclists ride on the pavement and there's a constant danger to pedestrians. I mean, I've had so many near misses. It's been a massive increase in the last few years. People, cycling around blind corners and so on. And it's really quite nerve-wracking being a pedestrian now. It never was.
That's because it's more bikes.
I think there are more bikes. I've even seen some of these electric scooters, which are illegal, but people ride them.
The evidence is that the roads have got steadily more dangerous for cyclists. So it's understandable that cyclists don't always want to be on the road. If they do get on the road, there's also a lot of evidence at the moment that a significant minority of drivers have become steadily more aggressive and will complain if a cyclist is in front of them on the road. I've never quite understood why they don't complain when they're in a queue of traffic. They don't seem to get angry at the motorist in front of them, but they do get angry if there's a cyclist in front of them. I'm not quite sure why. So being in a car seems to do something to people. But no, I think the fact is we need good, safe infrastructure for pedestrians. We also need good, safe infrastructure for cyclists. And generally, it's better if they are separate from each other. And the reality is, in a town like Abingdon or a city like Oxford, or many routes, if we are to do that, that will inevitably mean less space for cars. And that is the challenge. And in fact, Bath Street is an example of that. One of the things that we're looking at the moment, you'll be aware again, because you live near there, you know, that one of the rounds of active travel money was used to paint pictures of bicycles in white paint on roads like Bath Street. I'm not aware of any evidence that that's an effective way to make cycling safer, but it's happened. But we're looking at Bath Street, for example, and the question is, should parking for about 20 cars be a priority down one side of Bath Street? Or should we use that space to put in a proper segregated cycle lane? But for most of its length, there is enough room to do that. But I absolutely guarantee when we propose that, which we might, I will get several angry letters from residents on Bath Street, or from that row of houses, who will say, but we've been parking in those parking bays for years without ever being ticketed because there's been no enforcement. And this is terrible that you're taking it away.
But on that, it's got to be a properly end-to-end route.
Yeah.
We're getting into real detail here, but that, you make a cycle lane there, and then you immediately come to the Stratton Way
Absolutely.
junction.
And so you've also got to change
they've
the
got
junction.
to get off, so
Yeah.
you might be able to go into your cycle lane and you get off. So
That ties back into having 20-mile-an-hour limits, being able to do the kind of treatment to that junction, which would also make the junction safer for pedestrians and cyclists. I don't know if you've ever been and stood there for half an hour just to watch, because I'm sad enough that that's the kind of thing I do sometimes. But hundreds and hundreds of people cross that junction on foot or by bike in any part of the day. But the design is to allow cars to travel through at 30 miles an hour pretty much unencumbered, other than when the lights are triggered. And they're dreadful lights, because they're the kind of lights where you press the button and by the time the lights go on, the traffic's already all gone through anyway. Which is another one of my bugbears. Sorry, you're going to get all my bugbears today. So I think probably we're drawing to an end. I'm happy to, I don't have to rush if anyone, sorry, appreciate the staff might want to leave. If anyone has anything particular they want to ask me just in the couple of minutes after we finish, I'm happy to chat. But thank you for listening to me. I apologise, I've banged on a lot. But it's really useful for me to say these things to an audience of people that I know are actually engaged and understand the issues. And again, I'll reiterate Layla's thanks. She does have a very busy diary, but she really does enjoy and appreciate these kind of meetings with constituents where we can discuss these kind of issues. And she won't always be able to say yes to every invitation, but do keep asking her to do things like this, because it really does help strengthen her voice in Parliament when she can say, my constituents really care about this stuff and I'm reflecting their concerns, not just speaking for myself.
Well, can we thank Neil very much?